Good afternoon. I want to first thank Rusi for hosting us in such an esteemed location, and a warm welcome to all of you who are here in attendance, but also those of you who are watching on the video link. We often hear the story of corrupt, war-torn African dictatorships. We're here today to tell you another side of the story. By way of introduction, I'm John Prendergast, and I co-founded the Sentry with George Clooney, who, in addition to his day job, is the co-founder with Amal Clooney of the Clooney Foundation for Justice, a strategic partner of the Sentry. We're here today to launch the Sentry's newest report called the Taking of South Sudan. Joining George and me on the panel are, to my left, Deb LaPrevat. She's a senior investigator at the Sentry and a 20-year veteran of the FBI, where she was a special agent in the International Corruption Unit. Brian Adeba, right next to George, is the Deputy Director of Policy at the Enough Project, which is also a partner organization of the Sentry. Originally from South Sudan, Brian was a journalist for many years in Africa and North America. Last but not least, on the end, J.R. Maley is the Sentry's Director of Investigations. He previously worked at the Africa Center for Strategic Studies and the U.S.-China Economic and Security Review Commission. To all the journalists here and on video link, any follow-up questions you might have after the press conference is over can go to Greg Hittleman, who is our communications director. So thanks to all of you again for coming today. George, can you set the table for us?
Sure. In our last press conference that we did 2 years ago, we exposed government officials in South Sudan for their corruption. We showed evidence that the president and then vice president hijacked the country's fight for independence. We showed how they, along with other generals, looted its resources and started a civil war that's cost hundreds of thousands of lives and millions of people displaced. However, these governments and these government officials did not act alone. They received money, oil, transportation, and weapons from a vast array of people and corporations all over the world who have profited from this crisis. These profiteers include Chinese and Malaysian oil giants, British tycoons, and American businessmen. And without their support, these atrocities could never have happened at this scale. The investigative report we're presenting today will attempt to shine a light on a few of these war profiteers, some of those who were complicit in serious crimes, complicity that involves connections to international corporations, multinational banks, and foreign governments. This is the first in a series of investigative reports that are the product of several years of work by our team at the Sentry. We've reviewed thousands of pages of legal documents, audit reports, correspondence, public records, and financial documents. We have conducted hundreds of interviews in more than a dozen countries. We've also endeavored to contact everyone named in this report. This morning, we met with some of the largest banks and other financial institutions, Standard Chartered, HSBC, Western Union. We talked about how they can take steps to ensure that they're not being used by the international tycoons, brokers, and multinationals complicit in the taking of South Sudan. I also want to say we spent a good deal of time in 2005, 2006, 2007 in Darfur. Banks weren't always our ally and weren't always our friend. These groups have been an incredible ally to us. They are spending billions of dollars in chasing down financial crime. So you've all been given a copy of the report. We trust that you won't just take our word for it. I'm the son of a journalist. You're all journalists. I wouldn't take my word for it. I hope that you would read the report and hold us to account. Facts are stubborn things.
For the past several years, we've examined financial crimes linked to violence in South Sudan. We've identified cases of embezzlement, bribery, arms trafficking, money laundering, procurement fraud, environmental crimes, even multinational corporations providing direct assistance to militia that are responsible for atrocities. Every single case involves an international connection, either a major multinational company or a foreign bank. We've seen South African aviation firms providing direct assistance to the National Security Service in South Sudan. Ugandan private security companies partnering with South Sudanese security forces. We've seen multiple UK links, people responsible for embezzlement and procurement fraud who live not too far from where we're sitting today. We also see Americans, American armed traffickers and American banks processing transactions that are related to the cases that we profile today. Deb LaPravat, Brian, and I will dive into a few of these cases now.
First, we'll begin our case studies by looking at the state-owned oil company, China National Petroleum Corporation, which is the fourth largest company in the world. China National Petroleum Corporation is the largest shareholder in Dar Petroleum, which is the biggest and most important company in South Sudan. Sinopec, which is the second largest company in the world, is also a minority shareholder in Dar Petroleum. So Dar Petroleum produces about 80% of South Sudan's oil, which accounts for about 98% of the government's revenue in South Sudan. Our investigation found that Dar Petroleum is proactively participating in the destruction of the country. It has provided direct support to deadly militias, it has knowingly contributed to environmental destruction, and it has paid for government officials to live lavishly while the rest of the population suffers the consequences of a brutal civil war that has cost hundreds of thousands of lives. Internal records and email correspondence that we've reviewed at the Sentry indicate that Dar Petroleum played a role in the provision of supplies to pro-government militias and other military units at the height of South Sudan's civil war. In the regions where Dar Petroleum works, large-scale armed rebellions have challenged government control and thus threatened Dar's oil operations. So the government's army has used these loosely affiliated militias to fight the rebels. The militias help the government and Dar Petroleum maintain access to some of these oil fields even at the height of the war. Coordinating directly with South Sudan's Petroleum Ministry, Dar Petroleum provided hundreds of barrels of diesel fuel to these militias and military units. The emails that we reviewed are crystal clear about the recipients of the diesel fuel as well as the destinations. In several instances, diesel shipments were sent just days before military operations were carried out in the exact same locations. Now, although these militias were initially recruited to protect the oil facilities, they went on to become a central actor in the destruction of Upper Nile State. They're accused of burning villages, of targeting civilians, and participating in an attack on a UN protection of civilian site in Malakal, a place that George and I visited in 2010 when hopes were high for about to become independent South Sudan, and that attack left dozens dead. However, support for these militias is not Dar Petroleum's only contribution to the destruction of Upper Nile State. An unpublished study that was commissioned by Dar Petroleum itself about the management of hazardous waste associated with its oil production in Upper Nile shows the extent to which the company is aware of its role in the problem. At dump sites near the oil fields, the researchers found high levels of accumulated lead, mercury, and arsenic, all of which are toxic and linked to serious health problems in the country. Images included in the study of the waste sites at Dar Petroleum's facilities resemble open, unkempt garbage heaps. Experts warn that the contamination may impact the water supply of more than 600,000 people. The known public health consequences of exposure to chemicals identified at Dar Petroleum's facilities are significant, some of which mirror the concerns and the complaints raised by citizens for a long time: lung damage, nausea, vomiting, cancer, and even birth defects. Just a few weeks ago, South Sudan's government said it would investigate whether oil pollution is contributing to an uptick in birth defects in the region. But make no mistake, they already know. So why is no action being taken by the South Sudan government? Well, records of payments made by Dar Petroleum may help explain the company's cozy relationship with the government officials that are supposed to oversee its operations. Invoices and correspondence between Dar Petroleum and senior officials at South Sudan's Petroleum Ministry in 2018 indicate that the oil company agreed to pay $686,000 to Crown Hotel in Juba to cover bills racked up by the then Minister of Petroleum at a rate of over $40,000 a month. One letter related to the payment is addressed directly to Dar Petroleum's president, an appointee of China National Petroleum Corporation. The payments don't stop there. Other letters raise concerns about how the Ministry of Petroleum and Dar Petroleum are allocating funds that are earmarked for community development, for the development of the people who are being hammered by this war. And instead of paying for public services, funds were used to buy armored vehicles, to jumpstart oil production, and to cover the college tuition of the son of a military general under UN sanctions. Dar Petroleum is owned by some of the biggest and most powerful companies in the world: China National Petroleum Corporation, Sinopec, and Petronas from Malaysia, and they are all complicit here. These multinational companies are not just passive beneficiaries of a horrific status quo. They have actively participated in the destruction of the country. They've supported deadly militias, they've seriously polluted the environment, and they've paid off government officials along the way, all without facing any consequences. That must end now. Deb.
As the Dar Petroleum case shows all too well, natural resources, violence, and politics are closely intertwined in South Sudan, and we found that the same thing exists in the mining sector. In early 2016, a group of Chinese investors formed a company called Fortune Minerals with the president's daughter, Winnie. Winnie Kier was 20 years old at the time this company was formed. In August of that year, Fortune Minerals received its first 2 exploration licenses in mineral-rich areas, including central and eastern Equatoria, and areas adjacent to Mundri, an area in southwest South Sudan. Just 6 weeks after Fortune Minerals received its license in Mundri, government troops carried out operations in the area, and they included destroying healthcare centers, committing mass atrocities of mass rape and forcible displacement of thousands of people. Then in the spring, the military mounted its second horrific campaign and drove out thousands of people from the area. Mundi became the epicenter of sexual and gender-based violence by March 2017, including reports of widespread rape and abductions that were conducted by both the military and opposition forces. In other words, a company owned by President Kiir's 20-year-old daughter and her foreign business partners obtained a mining license in a territory in which the government's military, which are under the control of her father, President Kiir, later drove thousands of people from their homes, drove them off the land, and these people were subjected to some of the worst atrocities that were being committed during this war. Now, we've seen no indication that Fortune Minerals' acquisition of this mining license had a direct link to the increase in violence in Mundi and the surrounding area, but the conflict between owning a company and your father being in charge of the military was just a shocking conflict of interest. President Kiir's daughter's company received the rights in South Sudan's natural resources without ever having to disclose the amount of money that she or her business partners paid to obtain that license. Further, it's a requirement for mining in South Sudan to receive the conformed consent from the local community. This would seem that it would be impossible to obtain this informed consent, given that thousands of those people have been displaced out of the area. This is just the tip of the iceberg, though, when we're talking about President Kiir's international business connections. Corporate records reviewed by the Sentry show that President Kiir's business portfolio includes dozens of companies, some of which have young children listed as shareholders. Members of the Kiir family have stakes in banks, foreign exchange houses, airlines, oil companies, logistics firms, and security firms. And in almost every case, they are partnering with international investors from across the globe. For example, in February 2014, President Kiir, well, just months after the conflict started, President Kiir's oldest daughter, Adut, and one of President Kiir's closest advisors, formed a joint venture with a company owned in part by Gideon Moi. Gideon Moi is an influential Kenyan senator who just happens to be the son of former Kenyan President Daniel Arap Moi. The company claims to be a firm that's involved in the provision of services in the oil sector. So again, you know, the lucrative contracts are being awarded to President Kiir's family and his family members. 6 months after the company was formed, Adut Kiir transferred her shares to her then 2-year-old daughter. This type of conduct should be a red flag for banks. In fact, in September of 2017, the U.S. Treasury Department issued the following advisory about South Sudan. Corrupt officials steer contracts to businesses, particularly in the natural resource, oil and gas sector, in which they, their family members, or close associates have some level of beneficial ownership and control. This sort of advisory sent out by the U.S. Treasury is sent to 22,000 financial institutions and is crucial, and is a crucial tool for doing financial investigations. We think the UK government should follow suit and issue a similar advisory to financial institutions in the United Kingdom.
The people responsible for violence and corruption in South Sudan often have strong links to the United Kingdom. We found examples of warlords doing business with British citizens, UK nationals involved in possible embezzlement of South Sudanese state assets, and the beneficiaries of corruption buying homes here in London. Take, for example, Ashraf Said Ahmed Hussein, a Sudanese businessman who has been repeatedly accused of corruption in South Sudan. Most people know him simply as Al Cardinal. He supplied armored vehicles to the government, formed companies with notoriously violent military officials, and received hundreds of millions of dollars in state contracts along the way. He also happens to own a home worth more than £1 million, about 15 kilometers from where we're sitting. This man is a key facilitator of South Sudan's kleptocracy, and he has a home here, properties in Dubai, and companies and business connections in London and the United States. Although he is one of President Kiir's most important partners, Al Cardinal is certainly not the only middleman that profited from opaque deals with South Sudan's ruling clique. In our report, you can read about a British tycoon named David Greenhalgh, a British businessman at the center of a murky deal that saw $65 million transferred to a company owned by a senior South Sudanese general, apparently for a mobile radar system. But the goods never arrived, and tens of millions of dollars were channeled from the general's company to bank accounts for companies owned by Greenhalgh and his close associates. Some of the funds from this deal reportedly went into real estate in Uganda. No one has been held to account. Other UK citizens have been willing to start businesses with non-war criminals. A pair of British citizens, for example, formed an oil services company with David Yawiao, a warlord who forcibly recruited thousands of child soldiers and commanded troops responsible for widespread human rights abuses. The businessmen, named Abdul Karim Adam Isa Muhammad and Daoud Adam Refe Abute, forged the joint venture with Yawiao well after his role in human rights abuses had been well documented. These illustrative examples show why it is crucial for the UK government to act. As we discuss in the report, the UK and other governments have the tools to investigate cases like these and take meaningful action. Thank you.
So there's a long list of international investors that have been willing to form businesses with the entities responsible for violence and human rights violations in South Sudan. Perhaps no entity is more feared in South Sudan than the National Security Service, a secretive intelligence force that's responsible for abductions, extrajudicial killings, arbitrary detention, violence against civilians, torture, and much more. In South Sudan, they operate with near impunity. But even this violent intelligence force relies on support from a range of international actors. We have documents showing that a South African aviation firm called Vukani formed a joint venture with the National Security Service in December 2014. This is a year into the war, after a lot of human rights violations have already been committed. The documents show that they were willing to provide charter flight services and helicopters to the NSS. They're not unique. We found documents showing that there are front companies controlled by the NSS, and these front companies engaged and formed joint ventures and partnerships with private security firms from Uganda and from China that are operating in South Sudan. Of course, American investors are also willing to profit from South Sudan's misery. There was a court case recently in the Eastern District of California involving an arms trafficker named Ara Dolarian, who's an American. The documents filed as part of that case show that he tried to sell $43 million worth of weapons to a South Sudanese general named Paul Malong, who was the former chief of staff of the military. He'd recently been pushed out of government, and he was trying to start an armed opposition movement. He took exile in Kenya. In May 2015, Ara Dolarian was charged with illegally brokering the sale of military-grade arms and ammunitions as part of another deal, not to South Sudan. But he was also charged with money laundering. Now, this shows the importance of following the money and investigating the financial elements of war profiteering. But the money trail didn't stop at Dolarian here. According to an invoice linked to the weapons sale, General Malong tried to buy the weapons through a Kenyan shell company called First Monetary Security Limited. A couple months after this deal was supposed to take place, Malong was put on a sanctions list by the UN Security Council. But the companies under his control, including First Monetary Security Limited, weren't put on that list. If sanctions are really going to be impactful, the UN, the US, and other governments need to go after the full network of companies and people that are acting for or on behalf of these individuals. And then there's the issue of sanctions enforcement. Enforcing sanctions on Paul Malong should be pretty straightforward. But a couple months after his designation, he's under a travel ban, and he does an interview on the front lawn of his mansion in Kenya. That mansion's worth about $2 million. We reported about it in 2016. It's in a gated community, and the government of Kenya knows about it. So we've documented multinational oil firms profiting from pretty horrific atrocities, providing direct support to militias. We've seen environmental crimes, illegal weapons deals. Every single case, again, involves an international actor. That provides us with immense leverage. That provides us with significant power to act, and particularly banks and governments around the world need to take action.
So most of the actors named in this report continued to loot South Sudan with impunity. The methods they use to siphon off millions remain unchanged, and they have so far faced minimal, if any, disruption. In fact, many continue to live in wealth and luxury, even as millions of South Sudanese continue to suffer from the horrors of violence and corruption. The good news is the banks and governments around the world can create consequences, and they can build the necessary leverage for systematic change in South Sudan. It benefits the people instead of the extraordinarily corrupt. In the past, banks have shut out terrorists. They've shut out drug lords, so now they can also be used to fight human rights violations. We look forward to continuing our work with these and other financial institutions in this regard. John.
So George is talking about banks and the role they can play in terms of actions by governments. For example, the United States has made a great deal of progress in recent years by increasingly using sanctions in a network strategy. Rather than just sanctioning one official at a time, the U.S. Treasury Department has frozen the assets, the U.S. assets and dollar-denominated transactions of entire networks of people and companies complicit in terrorism, nuclear proliferation, drug trafficking, and other illicit activity. Today, we call upon the United States and United Kingdom governments to investigate and, if appropriate, impose network sanctions on Dar Petroleum, on the businessman known as Al Cardinal, and others in our report, along with the network of their business associates, their enablers, and their connected companies. To conclude, last year, under great diplomatic and financial pressure, South Sudan's warring parties signed a peace deal that is tenuously holding but desperately needs a boost. For true peace to have a chance in South Sudan, those that are complicit in the looting and the destruction of that country must face steep consequences so that the rule of law replaces a business model that's dependent on extreme violence and mass corruption. So we'd like to open it up for questions now, and Michael can field them from each one of you who wants to ask.
You get a mic coming.
Hi there, John Ray from ITV News here in the UK. Mr. Clooney, two questions for you, if I may. Mm-hmm. What makes you, a guy with a pretty good day job, so troubled about what is happening in South Sudan? And a specific, there are a number of British citizens named in your report. The longer the British government fails to take action, does that mean that the British government, in your view, is complicit in the horrors of that country?
Well, I'll start backwards and work forwards. First of all, we're just giving this report out now. This is a constant. We're going to be doing this. This is just the beginning of our process. We're certainly not saying that the British government is not acting. In fact, when we do these reports, we give some of this out to you. We give a lot of other pieces of information to government that they deal with. This is an ongoing process. I wouldn't consider it that the government is failing or certainly complicit. We would just hope that they would step up, and the United States has some of the same issues. We hope that they would step up and take further action. I'll give it to you. I'll make it make sense in a way. When we worked on when the United States was working on the Iran sanctions with other governments, there was so much money, and the governments themselves were working so hard at making sure that we could follow these shell companies. They changed their names. They'd be 9 different companies. You could follow them because there were resources towards it, government resources towards it. There isn't that kind of resources towards following these guys because there isn't an end goal of trying to get the Iranians to the table, for instance. So in this case, we oftentimes have to replace that. NGOs, particularly what we've decided to do. So while we're working on that, we would hope that the government will move forward and do everything they can, including sanctioning some of these people, freezing some of their assets. The Treasury Department of the United States, we hope, will be able to do that. We've had great meetings with, these banks have been, you have to understand that when we were working on Darfur, the banks were in many ways complicit. They didn't look. They wouldn't, again, they're shell companies. They wouldn't look those 3 names deep in the shell companies. They didn't want to know, and they were enjoying a fairly decent profit. The banks that we're dealing with now are the exact opposite of that. The meeting we just came from, they're spending billions, literally billions of dollars to chase down this corruption. So we have a great ally in the banks as well. I'm involved in this and have been involved in it since the Darfur stuff. I spent a lot of time in the region because it feels as if this is a region where it's been one of the most deadly regions in the world since World War II, and no one talks about it because there isn't really a great deal of attention. There isn't that much to get from it. Geopolitically, it doesn't play as big a role as other places do. This is a country that I feel that these people have every right to want to live and not be raped and not be kicked off of their land and not be murdered. There's been a genocide, and now there is a continuing version of mass atrocities, the likes of which we haven't seen. And so I feel like if there is a value in having a place in society where people pay attention to you. It's to take that attention and place it on people who can't get attention. So that's why I'm doing it.
Just on the British government
Right.
thing, just to clarify, I want to sort of make sure I got your message right. What you're saying is that the British authorities are doing some things, but
Yes.
they could do much more,
Yes.
and they should do much more.
I believe they should do much more. I will also say that we are also giving them information. They have obviously some of their own information. And yes, they should do much more. I think the United States should do much more as well. I think that under every regime, by the way, this is not a political issue, so that I don't want it to become a political issue. I was doing this under the Bush administration. I was doing it under the Obama administration, and there wasn't a single time that I didn't say that the government should not be doing more. They should be doing more.
But our governments, if they put their mind to it, have the power to stop what's going on now.
I don't know if they can stop it, but they can sure make it a lot harder.
And to underline George's point about, the British government has a number of options, the things that we're talking to them specifically about. So there's some things you can look at 6 months from now. Did this have an impact? And one of those things is that, the UK government has the authority to impose unilateral sanctions. They've chosen not to, as a matter of policy, chosen not to use that until after if in fact Brexit happens, until after they leave the European Union. So we're arguing to them, you have the authority, use it now. You can make a difference right now in South Sudan, number one. Number two, and Deb mentioned this, but I want to underline it, this whole idea of, the money, this illicit financial flow just coursing through the international financial system. Our biggest allies, as George was talking about, are the banks. But the banks can be empowered to act much more effectively when anti-money laundering directives come from governments. Look for this particular activity, look at these particular actors, and see the kind of illicit financial activity that is going through your banks. So the United States government, the Treasury Department, has issued two advisories, anti-money laundering advisories, that have application to South Sudan's illicit activity. We're calling on the British government to issue a financial advisory focused, an anti-money laundering advisory focused on illicit financial flows going through their banks. And I think that could have a major impact because you have a lot of money going from South Sudan into the British system through using British currency and being invested in real estate here and all kinds of other illicit activities. So these are the kind of things that I think, specific things that you can look at a few months from now and say, did they make a difference?
Also, really quickly, so we all are playing on the same field here. They're not using South Sudanese pounds. This is done in dollars mostly, pounds and euros. So this is also, there's another reason why we come here to have this conversation.
Daniel Knowles from The Economist. But the years before 2011, before South Sudanese independence, and this is probably a question for Mr. Prendergast, you were one of the big advocates for South Sudanese independence. Was it a mistake to essentially hand over all of the kind of financial flows that was then Sudanese oil to the SPLA? Was this not kind of an inevitable result of that?
Yeah, it's a really interesting story. You had a peace agreement that ended a war that was, at the time, arguably the second deadliest war in the world after the Congo. Second deadliest war perhaps since World War II. So it wasn't like the situation now today in South Sudan is terrible, but the situation in the context of the war between the North and the South in Sudan was one of the deadliest in the last century. So the peace agreement that was negotiated and brokered through a truly international effort ended up creating a wealth sharing provision, as you're referring to, that allowed for a division of the oil assets between the government in Sudan and this new entity that was set up in advance of the referendum. So it wasn't even an independent state, the South Sudan administration. Suddenly, this ragtag little group of people who used to be rebels, overnight, received billions and billions of dollars. No financial transparency, no regulation, no oversight. Not a penny of that was spent on development. Not a penny of it went into infrastructure. Not a child was fed, not a school was set up with any of that money. It was all stolen. The biggest failure, and I think the premise of your question is absolutely right, the biggest failure of the international effort in support of the peace agreement in South Sudan was not focusing on that core rot of corruption that immediately took hold and became the operating system of this new South Sudan state. And we, as advocates on the outside, George and I worked very hard to ensure there was a peace deal. We didn't advocate for South Sudan's independence. We advocated for a peace deal and let the people decide. Because if they didn't, the war would continue, one of the deadliest wars, as I've said, in the last century, not a small matter. So our view was, let's get to the peace deal, and then let's work on some of these second issues. But that secondary issue of corruption turned out to be the primary one in our view. And that's why we have focused our efforts now on this issue of corruption. Maybe we should have done it starting in 2009, 2010, but we've started in 2015. Late, but not too late. There's a lot that can be done now. It's tough to look back and see what went on and what could have been, and many other governments have done the same, asked the same questions of themselves as that you're asking of us today. What could we have done? I think corruption was the main issue that was left unaddressed.
Hi, Megan Specia from the New York Times. I have two questions for you. I'm not sure who's the most appropriate to answer, but feel free to chime in. So the first is China. You've focused a lot of your conversation on what the UK and the US can do. China is obviously a huge player in Africa, and in the oil industry in Africa in particular. Where does China fit into this picture? How can the US and the UK combat Chinese interests in the continent? And the second question is about the current peace accord, which is obviously stalled. Do you believe that there are any mechanisms in place in the current peace accord for accountability? And with the two major players in the civil war being the two men who presumably are going to lead South Sudan into the future, how do you see that playing out?
Do you want him to do a little bit on China?
You went to China? Or
No, Jerry.
Yeah, Jerry.
Thanks, Megan.
No,
On the question of China's role in South Sudan, the first thing I'd say is I'd emphasize these transactions are happening in U.S. dollars, and there are things that the U.S. and other governments can do to hold the people accountable who are responsible for the type of conduct that we're seeing and what we document in the report. China has an anti-bribery law that came out 4 or 5 years ago. I don't know that it's ever been actually deployed. There have been cases where Chinese businessmen have been caught up in corruption probes, but it's not clear that that is actual due process that we're talking about. While we hope to see a change in conduct based on some of the consequences that can be imposed, our primary targets for advocacy and the primary requests that we have for this report are to governments that we think are setting up the infrastructure, are willing partners, but are just not using and deploying the tools that they have, and that's governments and banks.
And on the accountability question, Megan, I think the peace agreement, of course, provided for the establishment of a special court that would create accountability for mass atrocities, for egregious human rights crimes, and of course, the South Sudan government has not moved to establish that court. It was to be done in coordination with the African Union. The African Union's ready to work on it. The South Sudan government has not given we have advocated strenuously, as have many other NGOs like Human Rights Watch and Amnesty and many governments. I mean, the UK government and US government have pushed the South Sudan government to set this court up. We can understand why politically they don't want to do it, because the first fingers that are going to be pointed are at the people who are deciding to set that court up. So this is the difficulty that is faced by policymakers. So next week is the UN General Assembly. We'll be up there. I'm going to meet with the South Sudan key leaders in South Sudan government, advocate and press them again. Many other governments, but the reality is this government doesn't want to be held accountable. In part of the reason why we set up the Sentry is because these legal mechanisms are so often are so frustratingly slow that whereas the financial accountability, where you can hit these people where sometimes it matters the most to them in their wallets, in their bank accounts, in their luxury housing internationally and other, is that we can use these tools to create the beginning of accountability. Ultimately, legal accountability is the objective. You'd like to see these folks pay for the crimes that they have, the massive human rights crimes that they're responsible for. And I believe they someday will. But in the interim, we will continue to press for that court to be established. We'll continue to talk to the United Nations Security Council about referral to the International Criminal Court. But again, the politics of the of the UN Security Council are such that that's not a very likely scenario. So in the meantime, we're going to press and push on the financial accountability in the hopes that at least we can get part way towards people paying a price for committing these kinds of crimes.
As NGOs, what are you looking at in terms of the future now? Do we see the funding splits for addressing issues like this moving more toward what you're getting now, to looking at financial crime and the like? And what is the sort of, not so much what the banks are doing, because they're spending a fortune on AML and, illicit money laundering and so on, but at government level, are you sort of an only NGO, or are there other people devoted, as you are, clearly and specifically to financial crime and tracking money? Do you feel like you're on the front of a trend to get other people to now address this specific issue, front end?
That's exactly the right sort of question. What happens is, we have to constantly evolve because the game keeps changing. We put a satellite up over Sudan and Abyei and the middle areas to try and catch people committing crimes. We caught them. We found mass graves. We found troop buildups. We actually caught an Antonov bombing villagers, put some of them on the front page of the newspaper. And for a period of time, it slowed down their actions. We'd go down to South Sudan, and the pilots would say, I used your satellite imagery to know where is safe to fly, and they were only committing crimes under cloud cover or at night. Things had changed. We were having an effect. But when nothing happens to them over a period of time, then they realize, well, if nothing's going to happen, you can't shame them into doing the right thing. So then our next move, if we're going to be smart about this, is how are we going to actually try to affect change? The next way you do it is say, well, okay, if you can't shame them, we can shame the people who do business with them, because they're going to be 15 kilometers down the street in their $2 million house, and they're going to want to go to the Ivy. And we're going to say, oh, yeah, you're going to go to the Ivy. You're paying for tanks and bombs to murder people. Now, how's that feel? Because you can shame them. You can make it difficult for certain financial institutions to kind of look the other way, as opposed to saying, now, you can say you didn't know, and we're going to agree that you didn't know. You didn't look, but we're going to say you didn't know. Now you know. Now what are you going to do about it? And that can be an effective tool, a much more effective tool than trying to shame a warlord, quite honestly. So for us, this is the next generation, and has been for the last 4 years, of how we decided that this is our best way of moving forward. We've seen it work. Obviously, we've seen it work in corporations you see now, starting sort of with the Blood Diamond movement, but companies don't want, their employees don't want to work at a company that is necessarily harming people. The people, the consumers don't want to buy from a company that is, that is guilty of looking the other way for these atrocities. You're starting to see these elements play out in corporate America. We believe that that's something that we can use to our advantage here, which is to say, well, we're going to expose you. We're going to expose you for doing this kind of business. The banks, quite honestly, got hit in the nose in 2006 and 7 and 8 and paid some fines for it. Well, they're our best ally now. They weren't before. So I think that we're onto the right track. There are other people that are doing it. Certainly governments are doing it. But we feel like this is the right direction to go, which is, follow the money.
And just to footnote what George is saying, since 9/11, policy has evolved dramatically. The tools that are at the disposal of governments and banks have multiplied. And as George mentioned, the whole experience around the multilateral, the global effort to squeeze Iran to get them to the negotiating table for the nuclear deal, whether they agreed or not with the deal itself. Watching how these methodologies were deployed to create obstacles everywhere for the Iranian leadership and elite and commercial allies to be able to do any kind of business internationally. Taking that lesson, looking at how the international community has gone after drug cartels, and then, of course, looking at some of the broader counterterrorism tools of financial coercion, obstructing terrorist organizations from access to the international financial system. George and I started the Sentry with all that in mind with one simple question. Why can't we use those tools for human rights? Why can't we use those tools for peace? And that's the operating premise of the Sentry. That's what this evidence, I believe, can be used to take action, to create leverage, not only accountability for these people and their crimes, but also leverage to folks who are trying to bring about lasting peace in countries that are forgotten, like South Sudan.
And again, to your point, which is, it's important to remember, at some point there has to be justice as well. It's a very important piece of this. But when your house is on fire, first you got to put the fire out. And so right now we're just trying to get this element, the atrocities themselves, to stop being funded. Then the next step is to bring these people to justice, and that's another step. But first and foremost, we're trying to put the fire out.
Henry Ridgewell from Voice of America News. Perhaps it's an attempt to answer your question, Mr. Prendergast, about why can't we use those tools that were used in the Iran nuclear deal and since. Well, we're sitting in a city now that groups like Transparency International suggest that $100 billion is routed through here in corrupt money every year. And that's because of the unique combination of lawyers and bankers and everything else that goes on here. It was in the interests of the British government geopolitically to get that Iran deal done and to work on those sanctions since. Isn't the truth of it that you're relying on the conscience of the British government and not its geopolitical interest? And there lies the problem. Because when you're dealing with Chinese state industries and other partners that the British government also trades with, they're not going to take those risks. They're not going to put that pressure on that they would have done with the Iran deal, for example, that you use. So you're relying on the conscience of the British government, and that isn't the bottom line for them. It's not the financial. This city, this country relies on open laws to an extent that it won't close up.
Well, quick answer to that, and if you want to add anything, George. First of all, remarkably, frankly, we've found allies in the U.S. government, in the U.K. government, within the European Union system, in governments all over the world. People who join public service because they believe in making the world better. And yes, there is no question, the premise is absolutely accurate, that Iran matters more than North Korea, than South Sudan on the mattering map of strategic interests. But when you have less top-heavy interests, like with respect to Iran, you have incredible micromanagement from the top over every detail of what policies are made. On something like South Sudan, there are caring, conscientious, well-motivated public officials who are able to run with policy initiatives with the support of their superiors and try to make a difference. And so we rely on those kinds of alliances and in order to move the ball forward on policy. Secondly, you have all these policy tools like unexplained wealth orders. And what's the other one in the UK they have that, what's that?
Asset freezes.
It's something, asset freezing orders, who, where they're looking for successes, and let's demonstrate that these policy tools can be effective. Now, are they going to go after someone with billions and billions of dollars invested in the UK real estate? Well, there's all kinds of political calculations they have to make. But if we can say, well, here are some houses, here are some accounts with these folks from this country, which, as you just said, it isn't maybe as important as some of these other places, why don't you take action on these? You can actually get some traction. So it cuts both ways. Yeah, we'd love to have the kind of attention and interest that policymakers focus on for North Korea and for Iran and Syria, but we don't. So we look for allies and we look for ways to provide success stories to those governments to take action with the policy tools, these new policy tools that they have at their disposal to be able to make an impact and be able to make a difference in these places.
Okay. Thank you, guys.
Yeah.
I
Thank
really
you very
appreciate you
much.
for coming out. Don't worry, there's no press here.